Hey everybody, I'm reading from my book on the ancient Greeks and disinformation, disinformed. This is from chapter 2. It's a section called Why We Lie and the Biological Basis of Rhetoric. So, thinking back, if you go before the ancient Greeks, you go backwards through the very first empires. You go backwards through the cognitive revolution, you start thinking about a time scale that's like 50 to 100,000 years ago, and then go further, extend that further to millions of years ago. Where did this all come from? All these things that we're doing, the horrible things that humans are doing, where do the good things come from? And is there some kernel, some origin somewhere? Researchers have found evidence of deception in animal behavior, and there are some other things to think about here that are quite interesting. Are humans alone in their lying and deception? Certainly not. It's not unique to our species at all. That revered and aforementioned classicist and rhetorical scholar George Kennedy writes in his book Comparative Rhetoric that humans are not the only deceitful creatures on our planet. And Kennedy writes, animals engage in deceit all the time, as when they hide under a bush awaiting prey. Some birds give calls that seem to be intended to deceive other birds. And an ape may pretend to see or hear something that is not there, to mislead others for its own advantage, as is often the case with deception. Kennedy tells us about a chimp named Matata, who would send a trainer out of the room on an errand, then grab something from another animal and yell and scream as though she were being attacked. When the trainer rushed back, she should look at him with a pleading expression and make threatening sounds at the other animals. We are the human animal, after all. And when it comes to survival, morality and law sometimes go out the window. Consider the case of Jean Valjean from Victor Hugo's literary masterpiece, Les Miserables. If you have no other option, you might also steal some bread to feed your hungry children. We all probably would. If you remember, Jean Valjean has a sister, I believe, with many children, and they're starving, and so Jean Valjean goes and steals a loaf of bread to feed the kids, and then Inspector Javert is hunting him down his entire life, not because of the principle of it. So you have these two competing worldviews, essentially, that come out from Jean Valjean and Javert. But who wouldn't? Who would not steal a loaf of bread to save the life of a child? It's a trolley problem situation. It's like the life of the child or the loaf, a slight reduction in profits for a baker. You pick the life. Where does that come from? Where does that system of morality and ethics come from? That seems to come from tracing it back again through the millions of years. That's some kind of biological, deeply ingrained, instinctual desire to protect other life, to protect the species, perhaps. It's rather complicated, and I'm not a biologist, but we are moved to action by our emotions, desires, and needs. We are biological creatures with bodies in the world. We get hungry, thirsty, cold, and tired. We have a need to conserve our energy and to survive. In his comparative rhetoric, Kennedy makes a compelling case that rhetoric is essentially a form of mental and emotional energy in light of an opportunity that may be affected by utterance. A little bit of Kennedy's academic speak, but what he's saying is when we expend rather energy when we speak, and so we're careful about it. We're choosy about what it is that we say, and we say things to attempt to change reality around us. give me that food, or I'll have one of those, or so on and so on. It gets more complicated than that, of course, but Kennedy's searching for a kind of origin story of rhetoric. The origin of rhetoric, of persuasive communication, is self-preservation, for Kennedy at least. I don't buy the whole theory, but it's interesting, which aligns with rhetoric's history in ancient Greece. Kennedy describes ancient Athenian citizens' need to defend themselves in a court of law. Likewise, we can see the serious urgency of communication in the non-human natural world, where warnings, mating calls, and cries for help are widely observed across species. It's a kind of cross-species communication. It's a kind of universal forms of communication across species. Warnings, mating calls, cries for help, cries of distress. Is deeply ingrained in our neurology as well. Humans are not the only creatures who persuade and who lie. And if you have a dog or a cat, you know they can be very persuasive, actually. They use little tricks and techniques of their own. Deborah Haughey has a wonderful book on animal rhetoric. I've read it with my students before. It's not a fun read. I mean, Haughey is a fantastic rhetorical scholar who's made a wonderful career out of very interesting work on embodied rhetoric. And there's a book she wrote, Rhetoric in Tooth and Claw, something about animal rhetoric, in the subtitle. It's quite good. It's difficult to read. It's not my personal favorite kind of style, highly theoretical, but I understand why some people do that. It's a good book, though, if you're interested in thinking about how animals communicate. I think Dr. Marilyn Cooper probably turned me on to this idea of thinking about non-human rhetoric, and she's written some really interesting things as well. I've read with my students. But can this theory of Kennedy's be applied in the digital technological age we find ourselves in? In modern capitalism, a company's survival and growth is its greatest priority. The company, party, so now I'm not randomly talking about a critique of capitalism here. I'm extrapolating Kennedy's theory to a broader economic and social perspective. The company, party, or organization will do whatever it must to sustain itself, like an animal does, to conserve its energy, conserve its resources, even if that means deceiving or violently attacking an opponent or a competitor. Imagine political attack ads. This is not at all unlike the instinct of a goat to ram a rival male with its horns, or a gorilla deceiving its troop so it can sneak off and snack on the tastiest fruits while the others aren't watching. And there's quite a bit of that going on in our country. Lots of the sneaking of the oligarchs, stealing everything. If the fate of a fossil fuel company is at stake, it will lie to you about human-driven climate change in the protection of its own interests, and really the protection of the interests of a few executives who benefit exponentially more than anyone else in these organizations. They'll lie straight through their teeth all day long until the cows come home. We're not all bad folks, though. That is, it's not in human nature to lie. The studies show, the peer-reviewed studies that I reviewed, show that most people don't lie. A 2021 study by Dr. Tony Doken Morgan, who's a professor of communications at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, found that the majority of self-reported lies were committed by only a few individuals. About 75% of the survey participants said they lied very little or told small white lies. Now, there are problems methodologically with self-reporting, but the study talks about that very nicely. The kinds of harmless deception that we deal out in interpersonal communications, like one partner might say to another, "Dinner was great," when maybe it wasn't particularly delicious, because you just want to communicate your appreciation. And we'll call that a white lie, of course. Granted, you still need to be careful with these white lies. They can snowball out of control, and before you know it, you'll be eating under-seasoned frozen chicken breasts for the rest of your life. Not my case at all. My wife's a wonderful cook and we enjoy cooking. But my jokes aside, 3/4 majority of the survey respondents lied 0 to 2 times per day. That seems like a pretty good goal. Try to get through one day without lying. Can you be totally honest for one day? That's an interesting practice. I'll try that. I'll be mindful of seeing how can I be perfectly honest? Can I really say, what would that mean? What does it mean to be perfectly, completely honest to everyone? Would it mean saying what you're thinking? The first thought that pops into my head is not always my most tuned and attuned thought. So to be perfectly honest, would that mean to slow down a little bit and deliberate and really consider, really listen to others? That might be a good goal. I want to tease that idea out a little more. That's interesting. 3/4 of people in the survey lied 0 to 2 times per day. That seems like a good zone to be in, I think. The top 1% of liars, however, average 17 lies per day. That's a lot of lies. I don't think I lie 17 times a day. I try not to at all. That's a lot. So what the study is showing is that it's a disproportionately small amount of people who do most of the lying. Right? It's these very small amount of people who are there's. It's hard to say what causes that. Is there something wrong with them? That doesn't seem fair or very, very kind. But they don't play by the same rules as the rest of us. Maybe there is something neurologically different about. There must be something neurologically different about people who don't have that connection in their mind where they say, oh, lying is wrong. Or it could be enculturated. So I don't know. But culture is represented in our neurology, in our brain. So, there are many different angles at which you could approach that. Anyway, there's these small number of people tell the majority of lies. At least that's what this study found. And that's a lot of lies. It's difficult for me to imagine how stressful my life would be with all those lies to keep track of. 17 new lies every day. And how disconnected from reality that would make you. And how your compassion for others would suffer. It would be a life of suffering, I would think, to lie all the time, to not be honest with yourself and others. But interestingly, the study's most salient feature was its longitudinal nature, its length. This was one of the first ever long-term studies of lying ever conducted. And Dr. Doken Morgan found that the amount that one lies varies significantly, even from day to day. So maybe it's tied into mood. It could be tied into external pressures and conditions. It's very interesting to think about. From my reading of the study and placing it in the context of my own knowledge of human communication and rhetoric, it seems to me that lying requires 2 essential factors. The first is some kind of particular disposition or character that permits lying as a possibility in the first place. It has to be someone open and willing to that technique and that tactic, someone who hasn't ruled it out. Most people deliberately choose not to lie, or it seems. I'm rethinking some of this because I've read Sapolsky now, and his work on determinism is really compelling, and I'm trying to think about how that might integrate with my rhetorical ideas. Most people deliberately choose not to lie, it seems, right? We want to tell the truth. We desire to. It's natural to want to find the truth, to want to know the truth. It seems, anyway, to me. It's natural to want to know the truth. The reason or capacity for this is not a fully sketched out phenomenon. We learn to tell the truth as a value which we glean from stories, parents, teachers, social systems. It's some kind of distributed ethos that's in our culture, perhaps. It's not from any one thing. It's not from fear of punishment, although that could play a part of it. It's not because there's one story that we hear when we're children where, the boy who cried wolf or something, but that's part of it. It's not from any one instance where we see how lying hurt somebody, but that's part of it, our memory and experience. For the ancient Greeks, like Plato, there was a daemon. Socrates, as a character in Plato's writing, often speaks of his daemon. And even in others who record the life of Socrates, like Xenophon, Socrates talks about his daemon. So it doesn't seem to be isolated to Plato's representation of Socrates. It seemed to be something he really thought. Then the stories, other stories about Socrates, seem to say he had a very strong inner voice, a daemon, he called it, a guiding voice, like our modern conception of our conscience, kind of like the little, in cartoons or in films, you see the angel and the devil depicted on the shoulder. But for Socrates, it was like an inner guiding light, an inner guiding voice. And Plato considered the daemon to be a kind of intermediary between our world and the world of the gods. Has some kind of, the self is a metaphysical creature. Again, something I'm thinking about quite a bit lately. The second factor to produce a lie, because like 4 minutes ago I said I was going to outline 2 factors, but the second factor, so something about disposition or character or value system, something idiosyncratic in the individual, could be trauma even, right? I just read Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal, talking about how our whole social structure is traumatizing, causes neuroses. That's a Freudian idea as well. So something about disposition or character, something in us, a permissibility for those that lie, and it's a very small number of people who lie, but they lie a lot. The second factor to produce a lie is that the conditions must arise wherein a person finds it advantageous. And so you need a social system, like capitalism that has these disproportionate advantages. And I'm not, we're saving the political economic stuff for another time. I'm not interested in critiquing or praising capitalism right now. I'm just saying in this particular system, there are many opportunities where it is advantageous to lie. We don't have a social system really that promotes honesty, and we've especially seen this unraveling in the last decade or so, now where we're living in this weird kind of post-truth world. The President of the United States lies regularly and fluidly and all the time. And so that's this kind of cultural dispersion. Again, not any single factor that can be tied to it. But it must, the organism, because we're thinking about animal communication too here, the organism must see some advantage, some self-preservation, some self-benefit to the lie. So the permissibility in the disposition of the organism, if it is a cultural organism, and then some advantage to doing it in response to a particular situation. Kennedy comes in here again. He demonstrates that lying can be advantageous to our survival or to getting what we want. Lying is a rhetorical response, not just to a communicative situation, but to the various pressures and conditions of reality, like a fossil fuel company whose survival depends on convincing millions of people that the science surrounding climate change is incorrect. And gosh, golly, they've done it. I've been seeing it through my whole life. The science is overwhelmingly X, but the propaganda on the mainstream news is overwhelmingly Y in favor of the fossil fuel companies. I mean, they advertise on these major networks. I've seen the silly Shell or BP advertisements with the windmills, and they want you to think they're like this clean energy company, and not that they're destroying the planet. And oh my goodness. Well, this is only one simple example of the survival instinct. The backdoor channels through which money moves to support various political or ideological positions is incredibly complicated, and it's obscured because they're private companies, and they're hidden in elaborate schemes of deception, offshore accounts and shell companies, and you name it. They've found deceptions upon deceptions upon deceptions. And it's well obscured and it's well hidden. But the purpose of deception, that's the end of the section there, actually. The next section is the function of deception beyond self-enrichment. I'll read that another time. I think that's enough now. So what we just read was why we lie and the biological basis of rhetoric, which I draw from George Kennedy. If you're interested in rhetoric, Kennedy is a seminal rhetorical scholar. I read him in my doctoral program. His books I would recommend are A New History of Classical Rhetoric. And if you like that, then his book Comparative Rhetoric, where I'm drawing some of these biological ideas. I'm thinking a lot about biology lately in terms of technology. I think that's probably going to be, it sounds so silly, but I think it's going to be my most important idea yet, is that all technology has some biological origin, just as all language does, all culture does. It starts with the human. It starts with the organism. And so I want to look at this phenomenon of how is it possible that multiple different isolated cultures, people, humans, developed pottery? How is it without communicating with each other? They independently developed pottery, different groups of humans. Independently developed pyramids. Independently and in isolation developed systems of writing. It must mean it was in us already, in our DNA, in our biology, in the organism, and it was through some interaction between the organism, the biology of the human, interacting with the environment, that these technologies arose. And so it seems to me you could build a theory of the origins of technology based on that, and it seems consistent with the science and a material view of the world. It's very interesting to me. I'm working on the arguments. I'm working on the piecing together the interdisciplinary parts of it. But let me know if that sounds interesting to you, because it's like I think it's the most exciting thing I've stumbled upon. I mean, I remember looking out the window upstairs from the bedroom and seeing the shipyard with the freighters in it, and the big bridge with the cars driving over it to Duluth, and just all the sort of wreckage and ruin of this area. And just like, where did it come from? How could it? Just a couple hundred years ago, there was nothing here. And so it must arise. It must, of course, very by definition, all technologies are created by humans. So it's not just some weird invention. That's what we're kind of overturning, is the idea that some person has some brilliant idea that comes from the ether. That's an ancient way of thinking about inspiration, literally like the gods are funneling ideas through you, when actually they arise from you and then go out into the world, it seems. It comes from biology first. It must, if you follow a purely material explanation of the universe. You don't need that theory if you believe in divine inspiration and things like that. Then, you're probably more likely to think that, people go around and sometimes they have a great idea. Thomas Edison invents a light bulb or something. There was something particular about the individual that contributed something. I tend to think of it more like, I love Einstein. I'm so glad he existed and he did all that work. But if not for him, someone else likely would have stumbled upon it. But all the conditions were right there for he to do it. And even in the patent office reviewing the patent applications for radio technologies helped inspire then his work. So it's about having the right brain and the right environment, and certain things emerge from the universe that we did. Now that is a Platonic idea, that knowledge is uncovering something that's already there. And isn't that what physics and mathematics essentially do? Uncover laws of the universe that are already there. Okay, well, there's much to think about. I love the relationship between the humanities and STEM and biology and philosophy. And so I'm thinking a lot about those things, and I hope to get all that out in a book fairly soon, one of these days. I'm working on a few things. I'm working on the second edition of my textbook right now, and I'm working on this alternative self-help series and doing lots of writing and lots of projects right now. So I hope you'll stay tuned, and I hope you enjoyed reading from my book on the ancient Greeks and disinformation.